Freedom 250, Ilia Topuria lost to Justin Gaethje and is therefore no longer the lightweight champion. In my mind and in many people's minds, there is no doubt about who is the pound for pound best fighter on the planet right now, and he is Islam Makhachev, the current UFC welterweight champion. And in this video, we are going to look at potential opponents for Makhachev and assess how comfortable or how competitive those fights could be. Now, I say potential, we are also going to include Ian Machado Gary in this list, and we know that Gary will be facing Makhachev for the welterweight title in a couple months at UFC 330. But a bit of background as to why Makhachev is the pound for pound best fighter on the planet right now. It's not because Ilia Topuria lost the lightweight championship. It's because Makhachev is building his own legacy. He himself is a former lightweight champion, and he has the record number of defenses for that belt at 4. He's one win away from a 17th consecutive win in the UFC. He holds the record at the moment, tied with Anderson Silva at 16. So one more win against Gary basically creates history. And that win will also begin a welterweight reign, which arguably puts him on the ladder to becoming a real serious GOAT contender. Right now, I would say he's a legend, but if he has a successful reign at welterweight alongside what he's been able to do at lightweight, I genuinely believe this is someone who you could throw in there in the category with John Jones and George St. Pierre, because he would have done great things at 2 divisions. So let's get into it. Just as a recap, we're going to look at these potential opponents. Will they be comfortable? Will they be competitive? Let's take a look. And we start with none other than Ilia Topuria himself. Now, this was a fight that perhaps could have been possible had Topuria won at Freedom 250 against Justin Gaethje. Perhaps he would have vacated the lightweight championship, moved up to welterweight and challenged for the welterweight title. However, that's not going to happen, but in theory, if it did happen, we know that Topuria would potentially pose some danger to Makhachev with his striking. He's knocked out legends with his fist power. The likes of Volkanovski, Holloway and Oliveira have fell victim to Topuria's punching power. However, I would say one thing that sets Islam Makhachev apart from Topuria is the wrestling. And we know that Topuria hasn't really faced an elite wrestler, with the exception of Charles Oliveira. And I actually think by Topuria knocking out Oliveira so early on, we're not really yet to see him face somebody who actually is able to get him in a bear hug, get him on the ground in a grapple situation, and see how good Topuria's defense is in that situation. And just based off of the Topuria we saw at Freedom 250, he was pretty much, out punched by Gaethje for the whole fight. I would say this current version of Topuria is a comfortable win for Makhachev. We then move on to the man who is going to challenge Makhachev for that welterweight title in a couple months at UFC 330, Ian Machado Gary. Now, I think there's no doubt about it, in my opinion, even in a stacked welterweight division, Ian Machado Gary is the most deserving of a title shot. He's on a good run, and even though he hasn't been knocking guys out, he has a long list of successful wins against fairly good opponents. You know, he's beat the likes of Bilal Muhammad, Carlos Prates. He had a very competitive fight against Shavkat, which I appreciate wasn't a win, but I think that himself, particularly in a division where Shavkat is inactive, makes Gary the #1 contender. What I think is going to provide some challenges potentially for Makhachev is the fact that Ian Gary has a long range. He will easily have the longest range that Makhachev will have faced in his career. He is very good with his striking. Even though his striking doesn't necessarily knock you out, he can tag you, he can put combos on you with his striking. And it will be interesting to see how Makhachev can close that distance against Gary. A lot of people felt that Makhachev would have challenges against Jack Della Maddalena at welterweight in his debut fight in that division for the belt, because Maddalena himself is a good striker, but Maddalena is 5'11", so he's by no means a short or small man, but he's definitely not as big as Gary, who is a lot bigger in his stature and also 6 foot plus. So I think Gary's going to pose some interesting challenges for Makhachev. I think also Gary has decent wrestling defense, so that's something which, if he is taken to the ground, he might be able to deal with better than the average fighter in this division. I still think Makhachev goes into this fight as the favourite, but I do think it will be competitive. And then moving on is the Ecuadorian Michael Morales. Now, one thing you have to say about Michael Morales is, like a couple guys on this list, he has knockout power. He is proving time and time again that whoever you put in front of him can fall victim to his fists. He's just knocked out Sean Brady in what was a fantastic victory for his CV, because at that point, Sean Brady was probably one win away against Morales for getting a title shot. But Morales has now overwhelmed him with his KO power. And I think he could actually provide a really challenging fight against Makhachev, because not only does he have great KO power, this guy is huge. I mean, Islam Makhachev is coming up from lightweight to fight at welterweight. Michael Morales goes in the cage at welterweight and looks like he's a middleweight. He looks huge. I genuinely believe that this will be one of the biggest challenges in Makhachev's career, simply because he'll be trying to grapple and wrestle against a guy who is physically so imposing and different to some of the guys who he's had to take on before. So for that reason alone, along with the fact that Morales is very good with his KO power, I would say this fight is going to be competitive. I'll be really interested to see if this is the next opponent for the welterweight championship, whether it's against Makhachev or Gary. Let's wait and see. And then moving on to somebody else who has great KO power, Carlos Prates. He's recently KO'd the former welterweight champion Leon Edwards. Carlos Prates has great striking. He's obviously someone who is doing a lot of great things in this division. His only loss in his career comes against Ian Machado Gary, but that in itself was a very competitive fight. And some people actually think over the 5 rounds, Prates should have actually won. The one thing I will say about Prates is, even though he has great KO power like Michael Morales, he's inexperienced against elite wrestlers. I was looking at his resume recently, and honestly speaking, it will be really interesting to see him take on somebody like Shavkat or Sean Brady, because he hasn't actually got any background, as far as from what I can see, against a wrestler. Now, I'm not saying this guy can't wrestle and he can't defend wrestling and grappling takedowns. It might be something he's working on in the gym on a regular basis. He might be very good, but just based on the data which we've seen, it's hard to really imagine how Carlos Prates could deal with Islam Makhachev. So for that reason, I'm going to say this is going to be a comfortable fight for Makhachev. And then Sean Brady, someone who I mentioned a couple seconds ago, who, had he won his fight against Michael Morales, I think would have received a title shot. And potentially being Makhachev's first opponent as welterweight champion, because he lost that fight against Morales on the same night Makhachev became welterweight champion when he defeated Jack Della Maddalena. Now, since then, Brady has come back and he's got a victory over Joaquin Buckley. Joaquin Buckley is a decent fighter to have a win over, so fair play there. But I would say Sean Brady is one of the smaller welterweights, and he's probably at a size which is familiar to Makhachev. Most of Makhachev's career has been at lightweight. He probably will be used to taking on guys like Brady in terms of size and stature. And even though Sean Brady has good wrestling, how much of that is actually going to be helpful against a guy like Makhachev? Well, I suppose in terms of defending it will be helpful, but is he really going to be able to actually land some of his own wrestling skills against a guy like Makhachev, who is all round very good? One thing about Brady that he can't rely on, which I think works in the favour of some of these other guys, is he lacks expert striking. So he hasn't really got that ability to KO you at any second. And I think that's a key route to actually winning a fight against Islam Makhachev, because if you're going to try and out-grapple Islam Makhachev, and if you're going to try and score points over 5 rounds against Islam Makhachev, you're probably going on a bit of a long shot. That's going to be hard. But if you've got some arsenal in your hands or your fists, which are going to actually land the KO, that can work in your favour. And even though Sean Brady is a very good and undoubtedly one of the best welterweights in the world, he doesn't have that KO power in his fists, which can land him a victory against Makhachev. So therefore, I'm going to say this one is comfortable. And then Gabriel Bonfim, a real up-and-comer in this welterweight division. He's now number 5 ranked after beating Bilal Muhammad. And I think that's a really interesting fight to acknowledge, because Bilal Muhammad is a fantastic wrestler, a fantastic grappler, and he was unable to land any success against Gabriel Bonfim. Gabriel Bonfim beat him very comprehensively, with unanimous decision in what was a recent Fight Night main event. But the thing is, Bilal Muhammad is an excellent fighter. I don't think he's on a very good run at the moment. He's lost a few fights now, so I wouldn't say this is the prime Bilal Muhammad that became champion a couple years ago. And similarly to Carlos Prates, Gabriel Bonfim has not really faced an elite wrestler or somebody of even high level quality, with the exception of Muhammad. His only other win against a big name, I would argue, is against Gilbert Burns, who has recently retired. And he's just beat Muhammad, who's probably coming to the closing part of his career. Other than that, this guy continues to impress, don't get me wrong, but I feel he probably needs a really big name win on his CV for us to really take him that bit more seriously. Now, don't get me wrong, Gabriel Bonfim looks really, really good, but just based on what we've seen, you have to take into account that he probably hasn't had the higher level competition compared to other guys on this list. And for that reason alone, I'm going to have to mark him as a comfortable win for Makhachev. And then we have Kamaru Usman, the Nigerian nightmare and former welterweight champion. Now, Kamaru Usman will actually be taking on Dricus du Plessis in a middleweight fight this summer. And I think that fight is going to be really interesting to determine what happens next for Kamaru Usman, because some are arguing if he beats DDP, he potentially gets a middleweight title shot, and that means he's done at welterweight. There was, however, talks at the start of the year that a fight between Usman and Makhachev could take place, because Makhachev, who has the same agent as Usman, wants to face him and have a legend on his resume who he can beat. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen ever. I mean, Kamaru Usman is also at the end of his career, you would have to think. One thing I will say about Usman is, if in theory this fight happens, and I think this is somewhat relevant for Usman's fight against DDP, Usman, in my opinion, is a bigger threat than people realise. A lot of people look at his age and they look at some of the injuries he may have and think this guy can't go anymore. But I have to say, even though Usman has lost 3 of his last 4 fights, there's a lot of nuance to those losses. The loss against Leon Edwards when he was knocked out came at the very end of the fight in one he was dominating. Then the rematch against Edwards for the title, that was quite a close fight. He then lost to Khamzat Chimaev, who was undefeated at the time, but he took that fight at middleweight, so he went up a division and took that fight on short notice and made it competitive. And his last fight was a year ago against Joaquin Buckley, in which he won. So, Kamaru Usman, yes, his record in recent time isn't great. Yes, this is not the prime Kamaru Usman, but I still think there's a bit of nuance in his recent losses, and he's a better fighter than people realise. However, I totally appreciate that whilst he is a legend in this division, prime Kamaru Usman was still from 2019 to 2022. I don't believe he would be as easy for Makhachev as some people make out, but I still think he would be comfortable despite being a better fighter than, I think he's still a better fighter than most people give him credit for. And then we have somebody who at one point looks like an undoubted welterweight champion in the making, Shavkat Rakhmonov. Now, a couple years ago when Leon Edwards was the champion, a lot of people thought it was only a matter of time before Edwards loses his championship to Rakhmonov. However, Rakhmonov has been injured for a long time. He's now been inactive for over a year. On performances alone, if you're backtracking to what he's done in the UFC, you would have to say he has the most impressive resume. The number 1 contender, in my opinion, right now is Ian Gary. He's the rightful number 1 contender in terms of activity. But Rakhmonov has actually beaten him. And if you're looking at the rightful number 1 contender in terms of winning streak, then he's the man. But the fact is, he's just not been active enough because of that injury to be relevant in this division. And he's no longer in the top 15 rankings because he's been out for so long. But I do think if Rakhmonov was to come back and get a win under his belt against someone notable, and let's say he did take on Makhachev, he will be challenging for Makhachev. He's an excellent wrestler. He's got great grappling. He knows how to tire you out. He has better striking than people give him credit for. He's probably one of the bigger challenges in this division for Makhachev, in my opinion. This fight potentially doesn't have the entertainment factor that it would compared to other welterweight fights. It's not going to be a classic where both guys are swinging fists, but it would be a very high IQ technical fight. And I think Rakhmonov could match Makhachev and really make this a competitive and challenging fight. And then we're going to end this with a bit of a wild card. Conor McGregor. Now, Conor McGregor is actually filing next month against Max Holloway at welterweight. And in truth, if Conor McGregor continues fighting after that fight, and he recently said on Ariel Helwani that he actually has one more fight after Holloway on his contract. So it is possible that we see Conor McGregor at least one more time after that fight, perhaps in early 2027. It's very likely McGregor fights at welterweight. I don't think he's going to cut enough weight to go back down to lightweight where he's previously fought. Welterweight certainly feels like his division right now in terms of being active, but I don't think he's going to get a title shot in terms of merit, or I don't think the UFC will book him in a title fight because you don't really need McGregor in a title fight. You can put him in a freak super fight main event, and that will sell as many pay-per-views if there was a pay-per-view model. I appreciate there isn't anymore, but in theory, McGregor in a super fight main event is bigger than most title fights. So really, McGregor challenging for the title isn't something the UFC needs to consider, nor is he merited to a title fight. But in theory, if this was to happen, he would probably try to get in Makhachev's head, something which I don't think any of these opponents, with the exception of maybe Gary, would consider doing. You know, McGregor will probably give the trash talking or try and make this more psychological than any of the other fighters on this list. But the fact is, the fight is won in the cage, and Makhachev will have probably, by then spoken to Khabib, who got the better of Conor in similar circumstances. And the fact is, the prime Conor McGregor was a very, very long time ago. So I would back Makhachev to make this a comfortable victory over Conor McGregor. And if it was to happen, I think it will probably be one of the most emotional fights in the history of the UFC. You would really have that Dagestan versus Ireland angle, which has been so historic previously when Khabib took on McGregor. But I just think Makhachev right now is levels above what Conor McGregor can deliver. McGregor might be marketable, he might be watchable, he might pull on a really good fight against Holloway next month, but against Makhachev, I would say he probably stands very little chance. So that's it, fight fans. Those are the fights I would, that's how I would consider these fights occurring in terms of comfortable versus competitive. Let me know what you think. And also, is there anyone else I've missed? Is there perhaps another contender you would like to see Makhachev face? Let me know in the comments. Until next time.